everyone, and welcome to tonight's Fulbright New Zealand Good Works Alumni Seminar for April 2022. We're really excited to have our presenter tonight, who is Sarah Nelson. Sarah was awarded a Fulbright New Zealand Science and Innovation Award in 2017, where she completed an MA in Economics at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She then went on to do a PhD in Climate Policy and Economics at the University of Cambridge. Sarah's research spans the disciplines of economics and engineering and assesses opportunities to accelerate climate policy. She's recently moved to London for a role in an environmental economic consultancy, where she will continue her work on climate and energy transitions. So tonight, Sarah will be discussing ways policy can help utilise existing technologies to accelerate decarbonisation. Her talk will draw out lessons for the New Zealand context and discuss the implications of current world events on the net zero transition. So she's joining us now from London, where it is roughly 8 o'clock in the morning and it's roughly 7 o'clock here in Aotearoa. So thank you so much for joining us, and please welcome Sarah Nelson.
Thank you, Therese, and thank you everybody for joining. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm just going to try and share my screen, so please excuse me while I figure out the technology. I think you can see the presenter view now, and if I just hold on, sorry, swap presenter. Can you see the screen with the slide? Great, I got some thumbs up. That's great. Well, yeah, thank you so much for joining, everybody. It's lovely to see some faces from New Zealand and from Cambridge and the UK. Today, I'm going to talk about my PhD research in general, and also the implications for New Zealand and for the UK. So my research was mostly focused on the UK context. So I'm going to try and apply it to New Zealand, but I'm really interested to hear thoughts from people back home about how this might apply or what the differences are. So before I jump into that, here are some pictures of my Fulbright journey, which are basically pictures of me having a great time in the US and then in the UK. So as Therese said, I went over to the US, to Santa Barbara in California, and did a master's in economics, and did also squeezed in lots of time sort of exploring different national parks and made lots of friends. And then after that, I got an opportunity to come over to the UK to work with Professor Julian Allwood at Cambridge to do a PhD technically in the engineering department, but as you'll see, it's all in sort of climate policy, a bit of economics. And it was a great time. This picture probably doesn't do justice to the work that was also involved, but it's been a really fabulous journey, and I'm really grateful for Fulbright to kind of kick me off on that path. Right, so down to the nitty-gritty. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to first discuss a bit of sort of context about the climate progress worldwide and also in New Zealand and the UK, and what sort of the policy approach to climate change is. And then going to move on to my PhD research, which was about the balance of technology and behaviour in decarbonisation, and then looking at historical examples for the kind of pace of those transitions, and then answering the so what all this adds up to in terms of lessons for our decarbonisation process. So first of all, what's been going on with global emissions? I think the idea of climate change as a problem first emerged in the 1950s, and since then you can see from this timeline that there's been, like this timeline doesn't do it justice, but there's been hundreds of seminars and papers and studies and really big conferences. We've got COP26, of course, last year, and the Paris Agreement. But at the same time, there's this sort of continual upward trudge of emissions on a global scale. The first part of my PhD, I'm not going to touch on too much, but it looked at the kind of political and economic reasons for this slow process. In particular, I looked at why political incentive systems, including short electoral terms, populism, and so on, make it unlikely that politicians will take a long-term view and implement difficult policies in the short term. And also why individual incentives as voters aren't lined up with electing politicians who will take that long-term view and will implement those long-term policies that are needed to deal with climate change. So, as I said, I'm not going to go into that too much detail, but if you have any questions about the political economy side and so on, I'm really interested to hear them as we go through. So diving a little bit deeper into New Zealand and the UK, this graph shows the change in CO2, or the trends of CO2 emissions over the last 30 years in the two countries. And you can see there's quite a big divergence. Obviously, the scale of these emissions is much different, which is why I've got a percentage change. The UK has far higher absolute emissions. But it's interesting to note that, New Zealand and the UK both have very similar sort of ambitious rhetorics about climate change, and New Zealand in particular has this clean green reputation. But while the UK has managed to reduce their emissions by about 40%, New Zealand has seen increasing emissions over this time. Excuse me. So what are these emissions coming from? I've got this lovely picture on the screen here, and I think it's pretty well documented that New Zealand's emissions are largely from agriculture. So we have a lot of dairy farming, and that obviously creates a huge amount of emissions, or a huge proportion of our emissions. There's also emissions coming from energy sector and industry and other things, but those are the three major ones. One thing to note about agricultural emissions is that it's mostly methane rather than carbon dioxide, and methane is more, it has a shorter half-life in the atmosphere. So in terms of these decade or 100-year temperature effects, it can be quite a lot higher than CO2, carbon dioxide. In the UK, there's obviously the emissions come from a whole range of sectors. There's a big one there on energy supply, and I don't look sort of too hard at the detail here, but what I wanted to draw out from this graph of the UK emissions is that the reduction in emissions, which is that 40% reduction, has almost exclusively come from three sectors: energy supply, agriculture, and industry. And those are all controlled by these big supply side policies. So policies implemented by the government on either government-owned assets or heavily government-regulated industries like energy. And there's been really almost no change in the emissions coming from residential sector and even transport, despite the rise in EVs and electric vehicles. So I think this just gives a tip-off of the gist of the rest of my talk, but it really captures the idea that there is, emissions to get to net zero, emissions are going to have to be reduced in all sectors, but it's quite a lot harder, and there's been a lot less progress so far in reducing emissions from the demand side, so from households, from transport, and so on. So I just briefly want to give you extremely broad strokes, my interpretation of national climate approaches, both in the UK and in New Zealand. So I've got the two major reports in our two countries up here on the screen. And I think it's a fair interpretation to summarize them kind of with these 3 points. And the first is that climate policy is generally highly centralized, so undertaken by the central government on a national scale, again, focusing on those big and regulated sectors like energy and industry. There is often not very much power devolved into local authorities. And like I said, it's really driven by the central government's agenda and by the same token, by their politics. The second point is related to that, and it's the fact that much of the mitigation proposed or suggested in these policy proposals are for energy and industry. So a lot of it is decarbonisation of the electricity grid through renewable electricity sources like wind and solar energy and nuclear, and also things that reduce industrial emissions, both through efficiency measures and replacing new technology with new technologies and so on. And then that leads into the third point, which is that there appears to be a big reliance on technology. So both existing technologies, which are deployed in electricity, like wind power and so on. And then there is a big chunk of these proposals which are on research into underdeveloped technologies for example, carbon dioxide removal. So just straight up taking the emissions out of the atmosphere once they're already up there, for aviation, for other forms of transport, which rely on new fuels and so on. So that's kind of where my PhD deep dives. So one more contextual slide, which is that this kind of summarizes the technological dependence of some of these proposals. So this pie chart here shows from the numbers have gone away, but you can see from the sort of relative size of the three colors that much of the policies proposed in the UK's Committee on Climate Change report, which was extremely influential and sort of prompted the government to implement the net zero legislation. Much of that mitigation comes from new technologies or a combination of new technologies and behaviors, and very, very little, it's only 9%, the numbers aren't on there, but it's only 9% come from social change. So behavior change, like moving to a plant-based diet or turning down the thermostat, things like that. So that basically led me on to my first research question, which is how does today's climate policy balance technology and social change? So that's what I'm going to talk about now. Before I move on, does anybody have any questions? Well, I'm really keen to have a discussion at the end, but I just wanted to pause in case anybody had any questions at this point. No, I don't see any hands, so I'm going to keep going. All right, so in order to measure the kind of, or assess the balance of technology and behavior change and decarbonisation, I looked at those two things through the context of policy disruption. So it's a pretty amorphous definition or concept, and I had to define it and then quantify it. But basically, I took disruption to mean any swift deviation or any deviation from current trends. I then sort of separated it into technological disruption and behavioral disruption, which is to some extent a sort of false dichotomy, because it's obviously a spectrum, which I'm trying to capture here with this funky color scheme. But technological disruption is things like innovation, research, development, and then technological diffusion, which includes more prosaic things like construction and regulation, and then of course the adoption sort of either by a commercial sector or by households and individuals. Behavioral disruption, on the other hand, is things like beliefs, what we believe as individuals, what we value, our intention for our behaviors, and then the realization of those intentions and our choices. And then it also scales up to systems and social infrastructure that facilitate particular behaviors, and then all of that transforms into social norms. So I've got some pictures along the bottom here, and I just again wanted to show that it's a scale. So we have things that are basically purely technologically disruptive, like new forms of energy sources, like this is a hydrogen plant. We've got wind and solar. And then we have things which require both technological disruption and behavioral disruption, like electric vehicles. which requires innovation of new battery technologies, construction of new charging infrastructure, but it also requires us as individuals to say, okay, I'm going to, instead of buying an internal combustion engine vehicle or petrol vehicle, I'm going to buy an electric vehicle. The same can be said of heat pumps. I've got a rather uninspiring picture of a heat pump up here. But then we move on to things which are purely behavioral. So things like moving to a plant-based diet, or swapping aviation for train transport, things like that. So now that I've broadly defined it, I had to quantify it, this disruption concept. And I did that by sort of mapping a function of the sort of proportion of change. So for example, for a particular policy proposal, I took the technological disruption as a function of the percentage change in market share and for a new or existing technology, which is implied by that policy proposal. For behavioral disruption, I did the same thing, and I took a functional transformation of the percentage change in activity share for a new or existing behavior. So to give a couple of examples, for example, if a policy said we want to increase the share of electric vehicle sales from 30% to 80% by 2030, then I would look at the percentage change in that market share. So that would be, that difference between 30 and 80%. For behavioral disruption, an example might be, again, going back to the old plant-based diet. If there was a policy to increase the proportion of vegetarians or proportion of, people's diets which come from plants, at least, then the percentage change would be, for example, the percentage change in the nutrition of an average diet which comes from plant-based products. So I've defined it, and then I needed to find some data to apply that definition to. And what I did was go through, there was about 12, I think, detailed policy proposals for the UK. So this is all UK based, but it was from a variety of different sources. I've got their logos up here, but there was things like National Grid, which is the electricity grid governing body here, Greenpeace, the Committee on Climate Change, which is the UK climate change body, all sorts of different things, which I think gave me a pretty broad scope of a broad view of the policy proposals for the UK. And I went through them with a really fine-tooth comb and created this kind of dictionary of mitigation options, which were proposed across all of these 12 sort of scenarios. And then for each of those mitigation options in this dictionary, I drew out what the actual application was in each different report, and got about 540 specific proposals. So 540 data points on proposed options to get to net zero in the UK. I'm going to go on to the results. I know that was kind of a lot, but hopefully they make sense once I put the results up here. So the graph on the right is the results of this analysis. And along the x-axis, we have the technological disruption, which is embodied in a particular policy proposal. On the y-axis is the behavioral disruption. And the size of the bubble in this graph gives the amount of emissions which will be mitigated by that particular proposal. So the basic thing to draw out from this graph is that most of the options, most of the policy proposals lie below the 45-degree line. What that means is that there is a far higher reliance, or at least a higher reliance on technology than behavior change for reaching net zero. So all of these proposals, which spanned all of these broad kind of organizations and ideologies, most of them relied far more on new technologies or this massive scale up of existing technologies than they did on people actually changing their behavior and making different decisions. This, of course, isn't inherently bad. I'm not a technophobe, and I know that technology has provided a lot of mitigation in the past. But I think what is concerning, and what concerned me at least, is that a lot of this mitigation came from technologies which are currently unproven at scale. And this just means that there's a really high risk. There's a high risk that they won't actually be developed in time to reach our net zero by 2050 goals and to avoid overshoot of a 2-degree target. It seems like a really high stakes poker game to me. And so this is kind of where I took my research going forward, what lessons we can learn from that. So again, just to sum up the results of this, the flip side, of course, of that reliance on technology is that behaviour remains underutilised. So these numbers here are from the results presented in that previous graph. And basically you can see that, more than 50%, in fact, 65% of mitigation came from technologies. And by the same token, the proposals for each climate option, even when they relied on behavioural change, they were less ambitious. So there was less kind of a lower scale of change was proposed in each policy option if it was in behavioural than technology. So the research question that came out of this analysis was, given this fairly high risk approach that's being taken, what is the likelihood that we'll be able to reach net zero by 2050? And specifically, how fast can technologies and behaviours change? So I'm going to talk about that next, and how I looked at history to sort of guide that discussion. But first, just to pause and ask if anybody has any questions on that section. No, I will keep going then, and we can talk at the end. Great. So the next step of my PhD was to kind of look to the past and see what lessons it can give us in terms of the pace of technological and social transitions or social changes. And in order to do that, I built on a pretty big body of literature which looks at the pace and duration and scale of large-scale energy transitions. So this gives some of the results, this graph here, from the past. And I mean, you can see it's quite long. In general, the scale goes up to 200 years. And there's plenty of research on these technologies, these energy technologies, but there is no equivalent research on social transitions. So my approach was to take the methodologies from the energy transitions literature and apply it to social changes. So how I did that was I picked, they're not all up here, but there was 12 past transitions that I looked at, and I looked at 4 energy transitions kind of as a sense check against the literature to make sure I was applying the methodology well enough. And then I also looked at a bunch of social transitions. So social transitions are quite hard to define, unlike energy transitions, because they're one industry. But I define social transitions as any large-scale change resulting from social concern and involving behaviours. So I've had quite a lot of pushback in previous presentations on the fact that ozone depletion was in fact a technological transition, but it's a pretty good example of my definition because I put it in the social category because the transition away from ozone depleting substances came from a place of people, individuals being really, scientists, but also members of the public being really concerned that these substances were really damaging our atmosphere. And that was evidenced by a movement away from ozone depleting substance goods in sort of consumer side markets, like there were all sorts of aerosols and stuff which saw their demand fall off a cliff after the discovery of the ozone hole. And that was before any sort of government regulation was put in place. So I think that that is where that comes into the social side, because it's more about individuals making behavioural choices, which then prompts some supply side policies as well. The other ones I think are fairly straightforward. They're often in sort of coming from health concerns like leaded petrol and smoking, or safety and so on. And I think importantly for these social transitions, they are quite analogous to the transitions that we might see, we hope to see coming up in the next couple of decades for climate behavioural changes. So I'm going to go pretty methodology light here because it's not the interesting parts, but I just wanted to put this up for credibility purposes. And basically the process that I followed was I did a really deep dive in all these transitions, read a bunch, and also looked at data to develop these detailed timelines of the transition, with the technological developments, the policy developments, and the social developments, sorry. I then transformed the individual sort of timelines for each transition into unified transition frameworks, which describe the general steps that each transition would go to from sort of no supply or no behavior change through to market or behavioral stabilization. And they tended to go through fairly similar stages through each of these things. So there was often this period of blue skies research, of course, and then quite directed funding from the government. And then as the market ramped up, that funding was withdrawn, and there was some challenges along the way. But basically, I developed these frameworks in order to produce the next graphs, which were really the crux of the research. But these graphs show the duration in years of each stage of each transition. So the top graph, it's quite small, at least on my screen, so apologies for that. But the top graph is for the technological transitions, so nuclear, wind, CCGT, which is natural gas, and solar. And then the bottom graph shows the duration for the social transitions. I'm going to go into the results in the next couple of slides, but I guess just eyeballing it, you can see that in general, the social transitions which I looked at took significantly less time than the technological transitions. And in particular, a lot of that time for the energy transitions was spent in that very first page, which is the light pinky orangey color on the left-hand side, which is basically the R&D phase, which can take a really long time. But there were three main sort of themes which emerged from both the social transitions, and the technological transitions. And before I talk about the scale and rate, I just want to discuss those a little bit. The first theme is that this idea of kind of cross-development or cross-pollination of ideas or technologies can accelerate change. So, for example, combined cycle gas turbines, or the natural gas technologies, and also nuclear, built from military developments, which really significantly reduce that initial R&D phase, which can so hold up technologies. On the social side, things like ozone degradation and leaded petrol, it tapped into existing environmental concerns about pollution and so on, which again reduce the kind of social resistance to those behaviors and changes. The second theme was that there's an innovation trap, which I observed in both technological and social transitions, so which can kind of slow or hamper the early transition stages. So I'm not going to go through all the examples in detail, but basically both for technologies and for behaviors, there can be a kind of either a lack of funding or a lack of social momentum, and for social things, even sort of social or political pushback, which can really slow the transitions in its early stages and even, stop it, which would then have not made it into my study, but it's quite an interesting observation. The third theme is that both types of transitions are vulnerable to macroeconomic conditions. And this is not surprising, perhaps, because, political funding dries up in downturns. And by the same token, individuals don't have the money or the cognitive kind of headspace to make more difficult decisions during downturns, which means that the transitions can be slowed during these times. So just moving on to the actual, some numbers here. The results of my analysis were basically that technological transitions take far longer than social transitions to reach stabilization. So I split it into two periods. The first being conception to rapid growth. So that's that kind of kickoff period where there's a lot of R&D and then, or sort of ideas generation period. And then the second duration, which of interest here, is the conception to stabilization. So that's kind of the whole process. And if you think of it, the growth as kind of this S-curve shape, then conception to rapid growth is the first third, and conception to stabilization is kind of the rest of the graph. The numbers are up here, but you can see that in both time frames, technologies took significantly longer. And you can probably see where I'm going with this, but I think that sort of raises some questions about our climate approach, or our approach to climate policy, given our net zero 2050 ambitions. So these results are summarized on this graph, and which maps every transition that I looked at with the delay till growth starts, which is kind of that first period of R&D where there's no market or behavioral adoption of our new technology or idea, but it's kind of in the works. And the y-axis here is the linear growth rate. So once a transition kicks off, once it gets going, how fast does it actually propagate through markets or through society? And the optimal position of a transition, if we want it to be fast, of course, is in the upper left quadrant of this graph. And you can see that the only things in that vague area are social changes. So the results of this kind of summarizes the first, or this portion of my PhD. And I think the summary is basically that social transitions typically occur more quickly than technological transitions in the past. They have to have sufficient policy intervention. So that's, I guess, where our climate policy question comes in. But it provides this kind of interesting observation on our approach to net zero, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And again, there's my research question, which is the so what of this analysis. What does this mean for our net zero targets? So that is a point where I'm going to pause and ask if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, this is my last section, so maybe I'll just push on to the end. So there are three from my sort of overarching PhD research. There are three main reflections. The first is that observation that there's this really heavy reliance on technologies over social change in most climate policy proposals. And in particular, that there's a significant share of mitigation which is derived from highly speculative technologies. So unproven technologies like carbon capture and storage, which haven't been demonstrated at sufficient scales to kind of meet all the goals, all the promises attached to them, which to me implies a kind of higher risk strategy for reaching net zero. The second reflection is that in the past, large technologies have been slower to scale than individual behaviours. And for our climate policy, that suggests that there is a potential for behaviour change to accelerate mitigation in some of our hard to abate sectors, like residential and transport and so on. The third reflection is that there's this reliance on future technologies that I just described. It can deter or defer climate action. So I haven't talked about this too much so far, but this is an idea of mitigation deterrence, which is developed by some other academics, Niels Markussen and others, which is this idea that given that we're relying on future technologies to reduce our emissions in the coming decades, there is less impetus on us now to either change our behavior or lay the groundwork for slow social behavior change, or the development or deployment of existing technologies now, which means that mitigation is deterred into the future, which has a lot of impacts in terms of actual climate and temperature impacts, but it also means that if these technologies fail, we are going to face much higher consequences in 2040 and 2045. Before I move on, I just wanted to reiterate that this analysis is all based in the UK, but it's, I think, fair to apply to everywhere, at least that I've looked at, that there's this big heavy reliance on future technologies. One example of that is the International Energy Agency, which last year put out a report about, it was a really big influential report about the sort of pathway to net zero, and more than half, or it's about half of emissions reductions which were proposed in that report came from technologies which were currently under development. So it's just kind of an example of how this reliance on future technologies is so pervasive. So I've only got a couple more slides, but I just wanted to touch on the impacts of current events on climate transitions, because of course, everything that goes on in the world basically affects our energy use and then affects our transition to net zero. The first current event that I want to talk about, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is, a humanitarian crisis, and I just wanted to focus in on the energy impacts of it, but I also want to acknowledge all the suffering of all the people in Ukraine and elsewhere. But focusing on the energy implications, I think that you can kind of split the results of this crisis into two categories. And the first is short term, and the second is long term. There's been a lot of discussion about it, certainly in Europe, and I'm sure in New Zealand as well. But I think the short term implications is that in order to secure our energy needs, there's going to be this transition to hydrocarbons. So in the short term, the way that we can meet the shortfall from Russian oil and gas is by ramping up our own oil and gas and coal. And that, of course, is not positive. But then on the flip side, there's all this rhetoric about the focus on energy security accelerating the transition to renewables or nuclear. And so improving our prospects of reaching net zero. I think one thing that concerns me about this is that these short-term impacts might actually have long-term consequences because of lock-in. So if there's investment in infrastructure, new oil rigs or new coal mines, or coal mines that aren't retired, for example, that actually has lock-in which will last to 2050, which is not very far away at this point. The other thing is that there's really high prices of oil and gas at the moment, which could potentially stimulate investment in the private sector. So I think that this rhetoric of energy security being good for climate transitions is positive, but it ignores some of these lock-in effects, which I find quite concerning. The second current event is the response to the energy crisis. And I'm actually not sure how much this is discussed in New Zealand media, so I'm really interested to hear from Kiwis at home about this. But here it's very clear that there's this real crisis and pinch point in terms of energy prices. And the response to this crisis has been quite depressing, really, for the thrust of my argument, to be honest. It's all been very supply side. So what can the government do to reduce impacts on households, which of course is positive, but it's also about what can be done in the electricity sector to ramp up supply and so on. And there's been almost no change asked from households. So the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which I mentioned before, they recently published a report about energy demand in the context of the energy crisis, and said that reducing people's thermostats, so houses are largely heated by gas here, so if people reduce their thermostats to 21 degrees Celsius rather than the average, I think, is like 22 now, and I think we could agree that 21 degrees is still quite warm, it would reduce gas demand by a significant amount, which again would reduce that price pinch point. But that report and that observation has not been taken up by the media or politicians at all. I haven't seen any sort of large scale media outlet talk about the demand side, sort of proposals for the demand side response to the energy crisis. I think that the third current event here, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's quite an interesting contrast because, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing, there was so much asked from citizens and so many demand side changes that were, for the most part and for a while, fairly well adhered to. So it's an interesting lesson in that there is this example of where demand side policy worked really well, for the most part. But then that isn't being applied to the energy crisis whatsoever. So it's just a really interesting comparison that I think has particular implications for this behavioural changes that I'm proposing. So I also want to acknowledge that there's a few really sort of difficult challenges in terms of social climate transitions. The first is social infrastructure, this idea of designing systems and institutions to allow people to make the best decisions for climate change, which they currently don't exist, and developing them and implementing them is one of the biggest, I think, challenges going forward. Secondly, it's this idea that the poor will be hit hardest and first, both geographically, like the poorest countries will be hit hardest and first, but also within society. Often the poorest people are also the most vulnerable to climate actual impacts and also the effects of climate policies. And again, the third point, which is not super relevant in the UK, but really relevant in New Zealand, is this idea of how we protect the rights of Indigenous peoples for the Te Tiriti, to lands and practices and so on, while still moving forward on our climate agenda. And I think that a lot of times those things are absolutely aligned, but it also needs to be kind of worked into the process and the policy in places where that is extremely relevant, like New Zealand. So just to sum up, this is kind of a final slide and the ultimate so what, I guess, of my research. And it's this idea of behavioural change as a climate safety net. So I kind of think of it as an insurance policy against the potential for these technologies to fail. So in the past, technologies have facilitated heaps of mitigation, again, through the energy sector and so on. But future abatement will be more difficult, and it will have to, or it currently relies on a whole bunch of technologies which are currently unproven at scale. I think what my research has shown is that behaviour and social change does have the potential to be a climate safety net or a climate kind of insurance policy if these technologies fail to eventuate. And of course, I'm not denying the difficulty of that, but I think that there's the idea of this sort of social urgency to smooth the process is quite it's a growing phenomenon. So my mum sent me this cartoon the other day, and I think it really is true that people are increasingly concerned about the impacts that they see in their everyday life, and also the impacts that they can kind of foresee for their children and grandchildren. And I absolutely don't want to be a fearmonger, but the impact of that kind of urgency and concern is that it'll be increasingly easy for politicians to implement, somewhat difficult behavioural policies and embed norm change in our approach to climate policy. So basically, to summarize, and I'm really keen to get some time for discussion, and I think that my PhD has basically shown that if technological development is too slow or innovation is sort of fails, then social change now and behavioural change now means that their failure will not affect the outcome of our climate policy quite as much, and therefore galvanizing people to adopt more carbon-friendly lifestyles by implementing these social infrastructures and sort of decision structures around climate behaviors is, I think, a really, really important avenue of climate policy, which is currently overlooked. So thank you very much. That's the end of my slides. I'm going to stop sharing and really keen to get discussion and questions, especially about the New Zealand context. Jack, I can see a hand up there. Thank you.
Just check that the unmute worked. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Awesome. Thanks very much for the chat. That was very dim. Yeah, that was really helpful, and both seemed very relevant for society, but also for my research. Really appreciate all that insight as well. So super grateful. One question, if I may. I took some notes as I was going. I was wondering, with your economics background, did you take much opportunity to look into the financial costs of those two different routes, the technology versus behaviour policies?
It's a good question. Thanks, Jack. I didn't really look into that. I think that is hugely relevant, of course, especially for climate policy, where the costs of mitigation are so widely discussed, but no, I didn't look into them. And another thing that would be interesting on that point is who bears the costs. So, for example, social change imposing more costs on households than technological change. But I think that's a really interesting area for future research. So I'm not sure what your research is on, but if it is on that sounds very, very interesting. But no, I didn't really look into that. I was more focusing on the actual physical implementation.
Thank you.
Rachel, hello, by the way.
Kia ora, Sarah, great to see you. Gosh, I last saw you when you were a teenager, I think, so it's fantastic to hear about your research, and what a fantastic PhD you've done. I mean, it's interesting reflecting on what's happening in New Zealand recently, particularly as our fuel prices have soared in the last year, and how that has sort of influenced behaviour in quite bizarre ways. So as we might have expected, there's been a real rise, apparently about a 55% increase in EV sales. And the government has, of course, had a rebate for electric vehicles. And then the flip side is that the real gas guzzling utes and so forth, which are the backbone of a lot of our farming, agricultural, part of their workforce, I guess, they're becoming a lot more expensive. So as this, apparently there's a change happening very soon in terms of those heavy fuel use vehicles are about to get way more expensive. So they've just seen the biggest sales ever of those gas guzzlers recently in the country. So that policy from government is having an immediate impact in a good and a bad way. So, but yeah, there's certainly that huge awareness here, I think, of the need to start making those transitions. And I think we will be looking for some of those regulatory supportive government policies to help move us along that way.
That's really interesting to hear. I think Thanks, Rachel. I did sort of some of that ute tax stuff filtered through to mostly to my Facebook feed, it has to be said. But I do think that, you know, what I showed at the start about New Zealand emissions going up on compared to the UK emissions, I do think that New Zealand is quite like fertile ground for some of these behavioural changes. Just the politics and stuff in New Zealand is my impression of it is that it is probably more likely to adopt some of these behavioural changes and also use, like you said, Rachel, some of those regulatory kind of approaches, which the UK government has so far been fairly reticent on. So I'm, like I say, I'm really interested to see what happens in New Zealand going forward.
And another part of that we've noticed in our university as a COVID impact was, you know, with no travel, the university realised how much money it could save. But also in parallel with that, I think, was thinking about the footprint of all that travel and really reflecting on, do academics need to travel so much? So we've just had a policy put out for consultation in our university, which is really around hugely decreasing travel globally and really, you know, trying to get those carbon emissions down. So that's something happening a bit close to home too. Yeah,
I think that is, again, one of those sort of rollout impacts of COVID, which is quite good. You can see I'm in this weird, like, looks like I'm in a padded room, but actually it's like one of those acoustic Zoom rooms, which I have in my office, which is the same thing. I think it's in offices and universities all over the place, people are rethinking the need for travel. And I think that is really positive. Margaret, I see you have your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yes, and first of all, I apologise that for some reason I've got this particular artificial background and it doesn't include me, and I have no idea why. So I'm not trying to hide from you at all. I just I don't think I can change it within the context of this talk. But
no, it's a beautiful background, whatever that picture is.
Picture from my window at Paikakariki.
Lovely.
What I'm interested in too is whether in the sort of place you're working, you've got kind of a broad brush of other colleagues working in with you on things like what do we do about the problem that many ways of saving energy are almost for the rich because it costs more to do better insulation, it costs more to put on solar panels. We kind of need a whole sort of economic system that frees that up. My agitation has been that at least all the wiring for this sort of thing should be compulsory in all new builds to make it extremely easy to add these on as finances permit. But in many cases, people's finances don't permit anything of the sort. So do you have people working on the sort of personal economic side of how we overcome these problems?
That's a really good question, Margaret. Thank you. So I'm no longer in that research group, but I think that that is a research question which is getting taken up all over the place. And it's a bit related to what Jack discussed earlier about the kind of who pays for our climate policy. You know, does the burden fall on households or does the burden fall on governments? And I think that you sort of hit the nail on the head really by saying that there needs to be this economic structures around these climate policies, which provide targeted rebates or targeted subsidies for the changes which are necessary for households in particular, like you said, like wiring and heat pumps and so on. I also think, as you mentioned, that there's a role for regulation here. So buildings should be, like I said, regulated to provide the wiring or provide easy ways to retrofit to low carbon heating systems and so on. So I think it's a combination of directed government subsidies, which can be done through, you know, existing social schemes, I think, but also government regulations in terms of building codes, transportation infrastructure requirements, and so on.
Yes, agreed. We do have some. I mean, there are minimum standards for insulation, etc. But as I look around at new builds, I don't see them built to take advantage of the sun or, orientated in such a way that they get good solar energy. I don't. Everybody seems to have to line up with the street and all that. Still, things are, to my mind, pretty backward.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think that you're right. And I think that including environmental and in particular climate impacts into building regulations and infrastructure is really important.
Thank you.
Jimena, I can see a spidery hand up there.
Kia ora, Sarah. Thanks for the talk, very interesting. I wanted to touch back on one of your graphs. You have behavioral changes being faster in the top left-hand corner being the optimum place to be.
Yep.
And I noticed that you had sort of world, Denmark for wind, US, etc. So you had them categorized by, rate of change by country as well as by world. And the US seemed to be leading in those behavioral changes. The US seemed to be leading in a lot of them.
Yep.
So the US was in the top left-hand corner more than anything else.
Yep.
And even for the same thing, world was completely different to the US. Do you have any ideas about why the US might have been so fast, what they might have done in the US to have such fast behavioral change compared to the rest of the world? Because obviously, whatever they did, we need to do that globally.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I didn't explain like how I picked the countries, but the way that I selected the countries and then applied it to a global scale was that I picked the countries which had the most, they were either the first movers on that particular behavioral technology change or they had the most rapid change. So in those cases, and I don't have the graph in front of me, so I can't remember what they were, but those were cases where every country on that graph were outliers, basically. So the US in particular was an outlier. I think it was for ozone, was up there right at the top. Yeah. It's an interesting question of why the US managed to get it so far. And honestly, for something like ozone, it might be a cultural thing. Like this isn't in my wheelhouse really, but it is, I think, a general observation that with the media in the US and particularly sort of polarization, although that wasn't so much the case when this was going on, some things just kind of spiral. And maybe for ozone, that's exactly what happened. And I don't know if we can take any particularly positive lessons out of that, but I do think that there's a really big role for sort of media and even like environmental leaders like Greta Thunberg and so on, David Attenborough can play a big role in kind of getting these issues to the forefront of people's minds, which then increases the likelihood that they'll make decisions which line up with the climate outcomes.
Cool. Thank you.
Claire?
Oh, hi. Thanks heaps for your talk. My question was, I guess, regarding, growing up kind of 80s and 90s, we used to have like a lot of kind of public service announcements on TV, what to do if you have a burn, what to do if your house is on fire, how to stop people robbing your house. And I'm just in New Zealand, I don't know about overseas, but there's like a void of some really simple, kind of government-led tips that could be on the television. And I feel that the average person who isn't interested in climate change, if they don't know the why, they're going to see these news reports and they're going to ignore it. And can you see any progress being made in terms of how information is spread? Because it's very easy not to click on a climate change news report or to turn the TV off.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I guess like another example of that is the COVID-19 messaging, which was extremely directed and, bright yellow in New Zealand, can't really ignore that. I guess there is a little bit of that kind of stuff in the UK. I'm not quite, in terms of the climate side, I'm not quite sure about in New Zealand, but a lot of it comes from non-government sources, so NGOs or advocacy places, which I think are, people can more easily dismiss them if it doesn't line up with their existing beliefs. It's kind of like the echo chamber idea. It is a really interesting sort of perspective on whether those public service announcements could be used for that, and I think it could. One thing that I observed with the COVID-19 pandemic is that I think a lot of the impetus to sort of align with these invasive government, or sort of not invasive, but like, directive government policies, was that there's a really immediate threat. So we felt like we were in danger, and so we stayed home and so on. And that is not the case quite so much with climate. And maybe that's where these public service announcements are falling down, because people don't feel like there's an immediate threat, or the government doesn't feel like people feel like there's an immediate threat which they can address. But maybe as kind of impacts become more clear, that is going to be more possible. Because I think that you're right, that government messaging has been a little bit soft on the demand side, for sure.
It's I guess it just feels like it's going to take a long time to get through to some people, so you might as well start now chipping away. And I kind of have a second part of my question, if that's okay. So obviously the IPCC report has come out. I'm of childbearing years, which makes all this really tricky, the decision whether to have a child or not. I'm just wondering if you're aware of any kind of like New Zealand-based commentary, kind of summaries of the IPCC report in terms of its direct effect. I know there's a New Zealand chapter, but for effects within New Zealand.
I'm not aware, actually, Claire, sorry. I opened the IPCC report yesterday or recently, a couple of weeks ago, and it's so painful to read. But I would say the Carbon Brief is a website which I go to for pretty succinct and at the same time comprehensive summaries of those reports. I don't know, it's not a New Zealand organisation, so I don't know about the New Zealand context in particular, but certainly there's lots of places where they summarise it. I think also the New Zealand, what is it called, the Climate Change Commission in New Zealand, they have pretty good information there about the New Zealand context as well.
Mm-hmm.